Welcome back to the Hillsdale College Constitution Town Hall. We're thrilled to be able now to, in our second presentation, move on to a most important topic, and that's the question of what exactly is the Constitution? What does it stand for? What are how are we to understand it? Joining us today is Dr. Matt Spalding. To introduce him is a Hillsdale College student. Nicholas Plesha is in Washington now. Hillsdale's campus is in Hillsdale, Michigan, a small community of about 8,000 people. The Washington Hillsdale Internship Program, or WIP for short, has for 35 years sent Hillsdale College students to the nation's capital. There, they're kept really busy, and what they do is they intern full-time. They take a couple of classes, one in public policy, the other in American National Security Studies, and they do a bunch of fun things then as a group, and those things include going to Gettysburg, getting a staff ride there, learning about that battle. They go to Frederick Douglass's historic home. He lived in Washington, D.C. for the last 17 years of his life. And they do a bunch of other things that really build upon the things that they're learning in the classroom, the things that they've learned on Hillsdale's campus, and the things that they're doing every day. Nick's internship is with Illinois Congressman Peter Roskam, and he's going to introduce Matt Spalding. Nicholas.
Thank you, Dr. Bob. Well, I'm Nick Plesha, and I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Matt Spalding. He is the director of the B. Kenneth Simon Center for American Studies at the Heritage Foundation, where he is also a project leader of the First Principles Initiative. The mission of the Center for American Studies is to teach policymakers and political leaders about the principles of our political tradition and to explain the continued relevance and application of those principles in the 21st century. He is also an adjunct fellow with the Kirby Center. Dr. Spalding earned his B.A. from Claremont McKenna College and is a Ph.D. He earned his Ph.D. in government at the Claremont Graduate School. He has also taught at Hillsdale College, Claremont McKenna, the Catholic University of America, and George Mason University. He is the author and editor of several books, including We Still Hold These Truths, Rediscovering Our Principles, and also Reclaiming Our Future, The Heritage Guide to the Constitution, The Founders Almanac, and Patriot Sage, George Washington and the American Political Tradition. He is also a frequent guest on the Fox News channel. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Spalding as he speaks on the topic, the Founders' Constitution.
Thanks, Nick. Good morning, everybody. How are you doing? It's great to be with you, especially since I get to talk about a great topic, the United States Constitution. But I want to start my conversation with you this morning actually in Rome. In particular, the building that the Romans built, their temple called the Pantheon, which perhaps some of you have been there. It's one of their greatest structures of the ancient world. Was built so the Romans could have a place to keep their conquered gods, the flags and signs of conquered nations, statues of their Caesars, statues of their military heroes. But here we are near Washington, D.C. You've been there before as well, I'm sure. We have our own Pantheon. Many of our buildings in Washington are designed after ancient Greek temples and Roman temples. But one of those is the National Archives building. The National Archives building on the outside looks like Greek columns, but it's really designed to be a model of the Roman Pantheon, interestingly enough. But when you go into the National Archives building, you don't see statues of our military heroes. You don't see the signs and of our military victories. You don't see the things we've conquered. What you see instead is a small altar, if you will. And inside that, under glass, some very faded, hard-to-read parchment papers. And on those papers are a few words. You see documents. And that, in a nutshell, tells you the importance of where we place those things. Because those two documents, the Declaration of Independence and the United States Constitution, are the two greatest statements of freedom written by the hand of man in world history. And we must understand that. The Constitution itself is a remarkable document. It's only about 5,400 words. Fits on 4 pieces of that parchment. It's much shorter than virtually every piece of legislation, or most pieces of legislation today written by the United States Congress. It's the culmination of Western political thought. All the great ideas of the past that developed in Western civilization lead to this document. It is the architecture, if you will, of all of our liberties. The great rights in our Declaration are secured through this document called the United States Constitution. But as well, it's important to keep in mind that this same piece of parchment paper is a target, and it has been a target for some time. The Constitution is pointed to by every country in the world. All of those people yearning to be free point to these documents and uphold our Constitution. But the critics of freedom don't like the Constitution, abroad, but also at home. The progressives don't like the Constitution. Many that want to get around the Constitution. Many politicians, presidents, judges. They see the Constitution as a barrier. It's in their way. Because the Constitution is a bridle for what they want to accomplish. The progressives wanting to get around it so much they're going to invent something called the living Constitution. But that's very different from that piece of parchment you see in the National Archives. Today, unfortunately, in many ways, people say the Constitution doesn't matter anymore. When it comes up in debate, when it comes to debate in the United States Congress, when prominent members of the legislature, those in line to be president of the United States, are asked about the Constitution and the constitutionality of particular pieces of legislation, right, they say it's not a serious question. But more and more Americans are not agreeing with that sentiment. And they know the importance of that document. Because everything about our country, not just our legal system, but the way we constitute ourselves as a people, looks back to that old faded document. So what I want to do today is start us on the path of rediscovering it. Now, that period that led up to the American Revolution, from the end of the French Revolutionary War up to the Declaration of Independence, that long period, right? Remember these long train of usurpations in the Declaration? The Americans were forced to think through some things they hadn't thought about before, right? They had been pretty happy colonists for a long time, but now they had to do some serious thinking. We see that coming out in the Declaration of Independence. Right? They had to think about the real source of their rights. Where are those sources of those rights to be found? They're to be found in natural rights. Where does government get its legitimacy? The consent of the governed. We have those things in the Declaration. But now the question is, how do we secure those rights? And how do we create a government that actually is based on consent? Which points us towards another principle that is everywhere in the Constitution, it's everywhere in our system, but it's very rarely stated. And it's called the rule of law, which in many ways is the greatest accomplishment of Western constitutional thought, the idea of the rule of law. Now, that's an idea that goes back to classical antiquity. You see it in Aristotle's distinction about regimes. You see it in Cicero and other political philosophers. We see it in Western thought, in British history, starting and taking off the time of something called Magna Carta, 1215. You recall it, right? King John gets cornered by his barons, and he's got to give away a little bit of power. But the most famous, the most American statement of the rule of law is very simple. It's in the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780, written by John Adams. Right? He creates this Constitution, he says, so that we can have a government of laws, not of men. See, that's what the rule of law really means. It's a government of law as opposed to a government of men, which is, say, arbitrary, despotic, tyrannical, at the whim and will of somebody else. This concept of the rule of law means many things. And for the Americans, it started to flesh out for them as they thought these things through. One thing it meant is this idea of due process, a word that comes up in our Constitution, but a very old concept. What does the law guarantee you? It guarantees you the process to which you are due as a citizen who has an equal standing and rights. It also taught them that no one is above the law. No one's below it. Everyone deserves its protection, but no one's above it. You can't ignore it as well. There are also certain things inherent in the rule of law that you can't overlook. Certain principles in the law itself, inherent in the very idea of it. Ex post facto law comes up in our Constitution later as well, an ancient concept. You can't make something illegal after the fact. You can't do something today and tomorrow they pass a law against it and make you a criminal. But the other thing that it made them think of and forced them to think about is, what was the relationship of this rule of law to those who make the law? Because the rule of law implies that there is something above those who make it in the first place. There's something higher. There's something more fundamental. And this raised in their mind this idea of a constitution. Again, not a new concept. Aristotle talks about this as well. Magna Carta implied a constitution, something you're going to write down as well. But once you have this idea of equal rights, it becomes much more important to get it right. And you see, the British, they didn't get it right. They had something called the Glorious Revolution, which was pretty good. But they didn't do it. Because what they didn't have was a written constitution. We take this for granted. We have a written constitution. We assume that's what it means. The British had no such thing. And the Americans, having gone through this experience with the British, insisted on writing it down. Very simple idea. Writing it down in a way that puts the rules of the rule of law, the process, on paper, so that we could all read it. So that you could read it, and I could read it. Citizens could read it and understand it. Because we have the rights, and you don't. They wanted a fundamental document that wrote it down in simple language for citizens to secure those rights for themselves so that they could govern themselves. And this document then describes how all that works. Now, let's look at it. Let's actually look at the thing in our constitutions. Every citizen in this country should have it and carry with it all the time. It's a very simple document. Remember, it's only 5,400 words. You can't read legislation that's that short. After the preamble, which is this wonderful, glorious statement about its objectives, some of them have to do with safety, some of them have to do with how we're going to take care of ourselves, and then the others point to the future, securing the blessings of liberty. The document has virtually everything to do with merely securing and laying out powers, procedures, institutions, all those boring things that most people don't like to study. Right? But that's precisely what this document is supposed to do. Right? The Declaration has stated what our rights are, these grand ideas of rights grounded in nature. Right? The Constitution is about powers. Powers. It creates three branches of government. Branches of government are then described in sections and clauses after that. Right? The three branches of government follow importantly. The first is the most democratic, then less and less. Right? There's a purpose to that. The lawmaking, because the rule of law, is the primary branch, although they're all equal. The key thing in understanding how the Constitution operates is to look at the beginning of each one of the first three articles, which lay out those branches. They begin with something called a vesting clause. You see, our Constitution is something of delegated powers. The people who are sovereign, who possess the rights, delegate power to the federal government in the form of these vesting clauses. It vests power. It doesn't vest power to the federal government inherently. It vests power to individual branches. The legislature, the executive, and the judiciary. The three vesting clauses are different. The legislative vesting clause vestilates the powers herein granted. Very important. And then it lists them, Article 1, Section 8, the famous Article 1, Section 8, that lists about 16 or so different powers or things that Congress can do in its lawmaking authority, which was the most important thing they wanted to control, which is why they also divided it into half, 2 houses of Congress. But those clauses and those sections enumerate the powers that Congress has to make laws. Very simple. And by that authority of investing power into that branch, it's implied, but not stated as well, that you cannot, meaning Congress, the person who has that power delegated to them, can't go around giving it to somebody else. It's the legislative power. The president has the executive power. You can't give it and exchange it. Keep that in mind, because this is going to become a bigger issue as we go forward. Right? Delegating power willy-nilly to other people. Article 1 makes it very clear that government's powers are limited to those things enumerated. Now, there is something called the Necessary and Proper Clause, which says that you can also legislate things that are necessary and proper, it's this cordoned phrase, it's not open-ended, to carry out these powers. Right? That's also a source of great debate. Article 2, the executive power, vests the executive power in the president. Now, this is a little bit more interesting, more difficult. It's not power they get from the legislature. It's their own power. It's called the executive power, and it's vested in that person. Right? That's important because there's only one person in the United States who takes a specific oath in the Constitution to defend the Constitution, and is commander-in-chief. There's something about especially foreign policy that demands that type of authority vested in one person. But this raises all these questions, which we like to debate a lot, about the nature of executive power. But it's the job of the president to faithfully execute the laws, going back to the rule of law. And Article 3, which is the shortest, interestingly enough, vests its authority in the Supreme Court and other courts that Congress may choose to make. Now, this is interesting as well, because all of the judicial power is vested in the courts, but it's only the judicial power. They don't have the lawmaking power. They don't have the executive power. They have the judicial power, which is to say they can make decisions based on cases and controversies that come before them in exercising their judicial role. Other articles, then, after that, talk about how this plan is going to operate. Right? The 4th article talks about the relationship with the states and the federal government. Very important. The 5th article talks about how we're going to amend this document. We're going to change it not by interpretation, but by a legitimate process of amendment. And the 7th talks about how it's going to be ratified. And, oh, by the way, dates it in the year of our Lord and the year of the Declaration. The Bill of Rights, then, is added later. Originally, they were opposed to the Bill of Rights because they argued that the Constitution itself is a Bill of Rights, because it limits government. Fundamental question. Fundamental point. But they decided they needed to get it through in order to get the Constitution passed, so they wrote a Bill of Rights, which are restrictions on the federal government. The first has to do with substantive rights, right? Religious liberty, monumental accomplishment of the founding, religion, speech, press, assembly, petition. The second, protection of one's ability to possess firearms, right? Crucial right to keep and bear arms. 3rd through 8 is mostly procedural. It's about criminal law, right? The things you have to protect yourself against being wrongly dealt with by the government. And the 9th and 10th really states in very short order the meaning of the Constitution itself. All powers that aren't delegated are reserved to the states and to the people. There are 3 very important additional things that aren't spoken about in the Constitution that I want to mention very briefly. Right? What are called auxiliary powers, or auxiliary precautions. Operational things that don't get stated, so it's quietly important, but the founders thought they were extremely important. One is representation. Right? By default, we have a representative form of government. The founders thought this was very important because it filters the passions, right, through the process of representation. Very important to slow things down. They created a republic, not a democracy, a republic. They wanted deliberation and thoughtful legislation. Secondly, this concept of the separation of powers, which we've all heard before in our civics courses, right? Checks and balances. They wanted to take these powers, not only write it down in the Constitution, but separate them, break them apart, give them to this, and to this. And then even on top of that, they were so concerned about the nature of power in politics that they made them fight against each other intentionally. So the legislature keeps an eye on the executive, and the executive keeps an eye by appointing the court keeps an eye on the legislature. It's a brilliant plan. Why? Because of this question of faction and passions in man that wants political power. That's the argument of Federalist 10. Right? The way you recognize that is a fact of human nature. But the way we're going to deal with that is we're going to make them fight against each other. Right? We don't want to make it easy. We want to make them squabble. And when they squabble, what are they going to squabble over? Their powers. And what are they going to protect because they're squabbling over their powers? The Constitution. Right? It's quite thoughtful, quite brilliant. And the third thing that was important to add is the question of federalism. Again, it's all there. Perhaps not stated as squarely as we might like, especially nowadays, but it's the inherent deep meaning of this document, which is there's this division between the federal government and the state governments. Right? Certain things are delegated to the federal government. This is in Federalist 45 in your readings. Certain things are delegated to the federal government, national security, some things about the economy. Right? They're to do them right and have the powers to do it. Right? But everything else, almost all the things that deal with our day-to-day lives, are to be reserved to the states, to the state constitutions. Let me conclude by just drawing a distinction between the principles of government and the actual practices of government. Madison, for one, and others made this distinction very importantly and said there were two different compacts behind how our government was established. One is a compact about principles, the Declaration, how we as a people, what are the fundamental principles around which we're going to organize our society. But the other is a compact about how we're going to actually form the government, how we're going to structurally organize it. And for the founders, this is crucially important. All the things we think are boring nowadays, they thought were the essential qualities to preserve liberty. Because merely having an abstract statement of liberty, of declaring of rights, is not sufficient. You must ever be mindful of how it actually works. Because if you are not, you will lose control of it. Because sometimes the passions to do things, if you're not wary of how power is accumulating, can lead to something much, much worse. This is the essential meaning of Tocqueville's famous warning of the possibility of a new form of despotism. When you take a deep and powerful passion to make everything equal, egalitarianism, right? And you take this power of government to make things equal, and you continually centralize it, he says this might create a new form of despotism, in which government is the shepherd and the people are the sheep. Right? He warned about this a long time ago. The problem is that we've shifted away from constitutional government to something else, slowly. The rule by experts and bureaucrats and others who are ruling us rather than us governing ourselves. That, I think, is the real question here. The Constitution, at the end of the day, is not merely a legal document. It is a document by which we govern ourselves, and we must be the ones to reclaim it. I'm often asked when I speak to students and go on lectures, how can we make that argument? We are so far beyond our Constitution. It's an old document. It's faded. You can't read it. It's merely a piece of paper. It was so long ago. But think about that for a moment. It's not that long ago. We're not going back to Magna Carta. We're just going back a few generations. I was born during the Great Society. My father was born during the New Deal. When he was young, the great justice in the court was Oliver Wendell Holmes. Oliver Wendell Holmes fought in the Civil War and met Lincoln. When Lincoln was a boy, the president was John Quincy Adams. And when John Quincy Adams was a boy, he heard the gunfire, at the Battle of Bunker Hill. Our founding is not that far away from us. It is still within our reach. We must rediscover it. We must reclaim it. Thank you. And we have time for questions.
We do have lots of time for questions, and we'll ask our studio audience again to come to the two microphones. We are going to start with an online question. This comes from James from Cleveland, Ohio. Isn't giving all Americans access to affordable health care conducive to the general welfare? Why shouldn't the federal government be a part of this, especially if it has the power to help its citizens?
That's a great question, and this question of health care is a wonderful way to think through, as a practical matter, how the Constitution ought to operate and inform how we think about things today. It shows you how far we've gone, that it's a matter of merely, the debate is mostly about, here's what we want to do, how do we get there? What clause do we hang it on? The two clauses most time used to look to justify health care on behalf of the federal government are the Commerce Clause and the so-called General Welfare Clause. We claims both. The General Welfare Clause is actually a clause that has to do with taxation. Right? The notion that the federal government has the power to bring about the general welfare is incorrect. It simply is not there. Right? The Commerce Clause, which is the other one that's often pointed to, has to do with the federal government having the power to regulate interstate commerce, a very specific thing. The federal government does not have the power to generally regulate commerce. But setting all that aside for a moment, the health care argument is actually not argued for on the basis of commerce per se. Let me give you a particular example. The most unconstitutional aspect of the health care legislation has to do with something called the individual mandate, which is to say that the federal government is going to mandate that every individual buy health care insurance. Which is to say, put another way, the federal government is going to mandate, regulate, use its constitutional power to require each individual, whether they choose to do so or not, to enter a contract. They base that on the Commerce Clause or the General Welfare Clause. If the Commerce Clause can be read to say that the federal government has the power to regulate you who choose to do nothing, right? By choosing to not buy health care, you are choosing not to do something. It's inactivity. If the federal government has the power to regulate inactivity, you with me? The federal government, and that Commerce Clause, is literally unlimited. That, as far as I can see, that is an irrational argument. Right? That's backwards thinking. Here's what I want to do. How do I get there? Same with this phrase, general welfare. Yes, the general welfare is a good thing. The federal government does certain things to help the general welfare. It creates a framework of law, right? It makes sure we have a stable economy. It coins money to strengthen our economy. It protects property rights, right? It does things for the general welfare, very much so. But that does not give the federal government power to do things. The Constitution is about powers. Right? The answer to the question about health care has to do with states. Right? States. Let them experiment. Let them do different things through their laboratories of democracy. Right? This is a primary example, I think, health care, where the understanding of the Constitution has gone wrong, radically wrong.
Our second question then comes from our studio audience.
My name is Christine, and I live in Virginia Beach right now. I went to Hillsdale, and I wrote a paper my senior year, and it was on this question, but I still kind of wrestle with the issue, so I'll pose it to you and see what you have to say. I wrestle with the issue of whether the Bill of Rights was a good or a bad idea for the Constitution, because the Constitution is based on the natural rights theory of law and the negative rights theory, and the Bill of Rights is kind of based on the British monarchical form of government, and you carve out rights from that sovereign entity. But as Americans, we don't believe that's where our rights are. We don't carve out rights, they're ours to begin with. So the Bill of Rights, in essence, fused the idea of positive law to our Constitution, a negative law document. And now when citizens quote their rights, they say, well, that right's in the First Amendment, or they feel like they have to quote where their right comes from, instead of where the government's power comes from to take it away, which you articulated. It's like Article 1, Section 8 lists the powers that the legislature has. So nowadays, though, it seems prudent that the rights are listed, considering how much the federal government has expanded. But my question is, how do we fix our positive rights view of government and in the future guard against it when the idea is fused into our Constitution?
How much time do we have? And you spent a whole semester on this question, is that it? And you wrote now, of course, the answer here is actually yes and no. So that's we're going to have it both ways. Which is to say that the argument against the Bill of Rights, which is a very strong argument, is that the Constitution, because remember, the Constitution is merely about powers delegated. The Constitution, by limiting those powers, is itself a Bill of Rights, by radically limiting those powers. But the Anti-Federalists wanted a Bill of Rights because most states had Bill of Rights. At the state level, that's a good thing, right? Because state constitutions work differently. They wanted a Bill of Rights. And Madison, being the smart guy that he was, and he was a smart guy, we got to write a Bill of Rights. But what he did is he said, I'll write it myself. And so what he wrote is a Bill of Rights applicable to the federal Constitution. Right? It's what states' rights, but it states them in a way that limits federal powers. So the Bill of Rights itself, I think, works. Fine. It's not the problem. The problem is not with the Bill of Rights itself. The problem is what the Bill of Rights has been used to accomplish. Right? Through incorporation, the courts have said it applies to the states. But also, even more problematic, how those rights have been interpreted by courts to expand powers. As the Bill of Rights has become exactly the opposite of what it was intended to be, which is rather than limiting federal power, it's become an expansion of federal power to the detriment of state, local authority, and to the detriment of liberty simply. Now, the advantage we have, and this is actually a very interesting point you raised, is that given where we are today, however, what do we look to protect ourselves? Oftentimes, it's the Bill of Rights. What we need to be doing is using the claims in the Bill of Rights, the pieces of the Bill of Rights we want to press cases about, protecting property rights, protecting our freedom of speech, protecting our religious liberty. But we want to do those in a way that force us to look to the rest of the Constitution. Right? The problem today is that most people, when you ask them about the Constitution, they think it merely means the Bill of Rights. And that is a very problematic misnomer. That's what the courts think today, too, is, right? They want to spend most of their time talking about the Bill of Rights. We need to get back to this, use the Bill of Rights to protect those rights, but the rights are protected in the Constitution itself. Okay? So all these years later, I'm actually kind of happy with the Bill of Rights. But it still should not prevent us and blind us to getting back to the document itself and to the serious way in which our system of federal powers, limited state powers, local authority, broad kind of notions of self-governing liberty need to operate. I think we need to move in that direction. Our
next question comes from a participant in Erie, Pennsylvania, and Marie asks, We've heard a lot about czars recently in the national government. Presidents, including the current one, have appointed czars. Are czars constitutional?
Talk about a great opening. The best part of this czar question that comes is actually the notion of calling them czars. Is this not just, or as many people pointed out, there are more czars in the federal government now than the Romanovs had in 300 years of Russian history. There's a certain messiness in this czar question, and I want to broaden it a little bit to make you think about it a little bit differently, which is to say that in many ways it's not the issue of the particular czar. Whether someone is or is not a czar is completely arbitrary. It's not actually in their title. Right? My guess is there are a lot more czars out there than we know about. The problem is what's going on here. And as Congress has delegated all of its power, most of its power, a lot of its legislative power to these bureaucrats, right? And these bureaucrats are writing laws. That's essentially what they're doing. Those are laws. Right? And the question is, how is a president who has a constitutional oath to execute the law going to control it? Right? So what is he going to do? He will use his existing officers that, have to report to whom? The Congress. Or he's going to try to go around the system. And he appoints these people who are now called czars. They report to him personally to try to carry out his agenda. So in a certain sense, it actually makes a lot of sense. If you accept where we are today, which is in this terrible, bureaucratic, mind-boggling, intricate mess. In some cases, a czar is unconstitutional. If a czar is an individual who is doing something, they have not been confirmed by the Senate, and they're operating in a way that is essentially conducting and carrying out law, right, outside of the structure that Congress has passed, right? That raises a constitutional problem. But the larger constitutional problem, I think, is the more important one, which is that the czars, some of whom have been confirmed by the Senate, right, are largely operating outside of the constitutional structure itself, because Congress, by passing these messy laws, essentially have allowed these individuals and their minions to do what is their constitutional responsibility, which is to pass the law. They've passed the buck. Right? This opening in this current debate about czars should be used as a wedge to break open a much larger debate about the nature of how government operates today. That is the true constitutional problem.
We have another online question from Jill in Lubbock, Texas. Today, citizens and politicians alike defer questions of interpretation of the Constitution to the Supreme Court. What role should the executive and legislative branches play in constitutional interpretation? Who or what is the ultimate arbiter of the Constitution's meaning?
That's another great question. One of the key misnomers today, widely believed by students especially, widely taught in law schools, generally assumed, is that the ultimate arbiter, the decider on constitutional questions, is the Supreme Court. That is wrong on so many levels, it's hard to know where to start. But again, go back to your structure. The Constitution creates three branches of government. Each branch takes the same oath of office to uphold the Constitution, which is to say that the legislature has the same requirement, moral requirement, to uphold what they believe the Constitution means, to exercise their powers, to defend their powers, as the executive and the courts. That's the way the founders clearly laid it out to be. Having said that, the nature of the rule of law and the judicial power, I believe, and as did the founders, such as Hamilton and others who wrote about it, implies something called judicial review. In a case or controversy that comes before a judge, they have an obligation in carrying out their legitimate constitutional powers to take that piece of law and the Constitution side by side, weigh them, think about it, and take the side of the Constitution. That implies judicial review. in the cases and controversies that come before them, i.e. the legitimate judicial process. But there's a limit to that. There's always been a limit to that until quite recently. Right? The court can't go about willy-nilly saying the Constitution means whatever the heck they want it to mean. And if they do, the legislature and the executive, who have taken an oath to uphold the Constitution, right, have an obligation to challenge them by using their legitimate powers to pass other legislation, to restrict the court's authority, to create other courts, to strip the court of its powers. They can stop paying their wages. Right? The executive can appoint different judges. This is precisely what was intended. At the end of the day, the only final arbiter of what the Constitution means are the people of the United States. So the system is designed to allow these things to percolate up through a judicial system, come up in a case or controversy. A court makes a decision. They decide. The case they decide applies to the people in the case. It can set a little bit of a precedent, kind of tells us how this court might decide in the future, but it's not written in stone, by no means. Courts change their minds all the time. Right? But if the legislature and the executive disagree, they can go on and do other things. You got a crisis. One of the greatest crises, of course, comes up with President Lincoln. Right? And he said this case, the famous Dred Scott case, applies to the particulars, poor Dred Scott, but it doesn't apply to everybody else. It's not settled the question. The question is ultimately settled in another way. And the regular process, the way it should work, is it's settled through the legislative, the executive, the judicial, fighting about it, and ultimately through elections. Elections. When the people decide and send people to Washington with a different understanding or the same understanding, and that still doesn't work, what do? You amend the Constitution. And that's the way it's supposed to work. The process is still there to do that. The problem is that we have too often assumed and allowed this understanding to become so settled that presidents and legislatures are no longer willing to even question that. A recent president, not the current one, but the previous one, signed legislation that he thought maybe might be unconstitutional. And he said in his signing statement, it may be unconstitutional, but I'll let the courts decide that. That is a terrible, deep, not only violation of his constitutional responsibility, but I think fundamentally misunderstands how our system ought to work in deciding these questions.
We have time for one more question that will come from our audience in person here. Please.
Hi, Dr. Spalding. I'm
Hi.
Linda Kendall from Fairfax Station. My question is, today we have more than 300 agencies that regulate our lives that, in my view, are usurping the role that is mandated by the Constitution to be done by Congress. Do you see any path for reversal of this, and could you offer any pragmatic advice to achieve it? Thank you.
A great question as well. I mean, I believe the greatest revolution of the 20th century, and the 20th century has seen a lot of revolutions, is the shift from constitutional government to what we might call bureaucratic government. And the extent to which most lawmaking and ruling is done by a process to which we have not given our consent. Right? That is the modern problem. We don't even know how many of these agencies are out there doing these things. Right? Healthcare bill, perfect example. We didn't know how it operated. We still don't know how it operates. We don't know about how many, and there are just hundreds of commissions in it. What are they doing? Right? How do you push back from that is a much more difficult problem. It's going to take some time. The first step, however, is to understand and firmly come to the commitment that that is not how our system operates, and reassert that. Just as a footnote, I think that's what's happening right now. We'll just say politics changes these things. The first thing we must do is to reclaim our Constitution through the political branches of government, right? That's exactly how Madison and the boys set it out to work, right? You get that moving. But then Congress has got to stop delegating its power to these people. But the only way Congress is going to stop delegating the power, because they can't do all the things they want to do, is to not do some of these things. Simple. They can't run healthcare themselves. They've got to delegate it. So if you don't want these things delegated to these people you don't elect, who you don't know, who are going to make decisions, very private decisions in the most intimate questions about your life, if you don't want that to happen, you've got to get Congress to stop doing these things. It's a political question. Right? In the case of healthcare and almost everything else, it's a radical decentralization of authority from Washington back to the states. We've got to start governing ourselves again. I mean, these things are going to be very hard. The actual ways of doing it, at what point do you challenge what agency? Do you bring a constitutional challenge? Do you try to actually cut off funds? How that's going to operate is going to be very difficult, and you're going to have to let politics determine, like,